Hello fellow collectors, I hope you're all doing wonderfully well today. I haven't done a video like this before where I talk through a series of films, but I recently got the new 4K releases of Star Trek films 1 to 4, and I absolutely flew through them, so I decided to get the Blu-rays for 5 and 6, which luckily were both very cheap, so that I could complete the original series film run. Many of these films I haven't seen for years, and a couple of these I don't think I've ever actually seen properly from beginning to end. Definitely caught snippets on TV over the years, but never sat down to watch properly, and so it's been a really wonderful journey. As it was such a fun ride, I thought it would be a good idea to give them a dedicated video. Now usually when I'm making my way through a series, I sometimes feel like I don't have too much to say about one or two of the films perhaps, but being a huge Star Trek fan in general, I found myself with a decent amount to say about all of these. And so just a slight disclaimer before we start, as someone who is a big Star Trek fan, I pretty much grew up with some of the shows, particularly Next Generation and Voyager. I am undoubtedly predisposed and a bit biased to like these films. So with that in mind, let's get straight into it. We start off with what is definitely my favourite of the original series movies, which is Star Trek the Motion Picture. I think the last time I watched this was probably around 2015, and I remember loving it, so I was interested to see what my thoughts would be during this rewatch. This one for me is something akin to pure science fiction. It is a spacious and almost operatic film. There isn't really an antagonist, so to speak, but it's more a pure mystery and exploratory adventure into the unknown. And if that doesn't sum up Star Trek, I don't know what does. It perfectly embodies what I love about Star Trek and what I think it should all be about. Now I'm sure that at the time this was released, there would have been a whole host of emotions for those who loved the original series, as they've experienced 3 years, 79 episodes with these characters, and you are seeing them together again for the first time in a decade. Even though I've never really been hugely into the original series personally, I still felt some of that emotion. It definitely comes across. The film conveys the awe of returning to space and to the Enterprise, and you feel the warmth of the crew coming together once again in desperate circumstances. And so together they journey into danger to save the Earth. Now while I can absolutely understand why some people wouldn't like it, I love the space that this film has. I was reading that the initial scene where Kirk and Scotty arrive at the Enterprise is over 6 minutes long. And I think I timed it about 20-minute period later in the film where they are travelling into Voyager and nothing else happens pretty much except that they are travelling further and further inside. It honestly reminds me of some of the space that 2001: A Space Odyssey had. There is just no rush and I thoroughly enjoyed that. Also just to say that I think what they did with Voyager and how it looked was so wonderful. Looking at my screen, my eyes see the images, but have no idea what they are or what they mean. I've no idea how they were made, but I feel like the images and my emotions were perfectly mirroring what the crew were experiencing. It is just overwhelmingly large and beyond our comprehension. Lastly, I loved the climax of the story, the idea that it's actually a Voyager probe. It was only a few years ago that Voyager 1 and 2 reached interstellar space, and that really brings the story back to somewhat of a reality. Voyager 1 had only just launched a couple years prior to the motion picture being released, so it must have captured the imagination of the writer Alan Dean Foster. Overall, I thought that this was a truly wonderful film, and the 4K transfer is fantastic, night and day from my DVD, and it was just so much fun to revisit. Next up, we have what for many is the pinnacle of Star Trek films, and that's The Wrath of Khan. I'll chase him round the moons of Nibia, and round the Antares maelstrom, through perdition's flames before I give him up. I don't think there is a more quotable Star Trek film, and definitely not villain. Khan is such a legendary character, masterfully played by Ricardo Montalban. And this was another one that I had just such a fantastic time with. I don't think I'd ever actually seen the original series episode where Khan first appears, so I watched that prior to watching the film and I really enjoyed it. It sets things up excellently for another meeting between the two, and it was a great background to have for just how formidable Khan is. In a way that for me is reminiscent of sort of Alien and its sequel Aliens, in so much as they are both fantastic but such different films that somehow together work wonderfully as the original and sequel. The motion picture and Wrath of Khan, both so wildly different, do quite a similar thing, but in a way that just hits on the best of what Star Trek has to offer from two different perspectives. Wrath of Khan is harsher, it's more gritty, and while I suppose you didn't have to do much to have more action than the first film, but there is much more action here. It's a battle of captains, of wits, of skill and tactics. A tale of revenge that is excellently crafted. I really like the involvement of Kirk's son, which I think brings a much more down-to-earth and human aspect to juxtapose to the drama in space. The ending of this one is also great because there are real consequences. It's such a powerful scene between Kirk and Spock, backed up by the previous 3 seasons and 1 previous film, that adds so much weight to their sad parting. And I think William Shatner, for all his overacting qualities, plays the scene great, as well as the final funeral scene. Yes, another stellar, and yes, that's an intentional pun, entry into the Star Trek film series. Moving on, and we have Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. Here is where the films start to go a bit downhill for me. Now, I don't think The Search for Spock is a bad film by any stretch, but it just somehow doesn't work as well for me, and it's kind of difficult to put my finger on why exactly. Of course, this is the first film where Leonard Nimoy takes the helm, and so he's not in it very much, a given pretty much, as this is A Search for Spock. And possibly that's one reason why I'm not as fond of this one, because they lack the full chemistry of the crew together. However, there is a lot to like here. Kirk is great in this one, and he'll do anything, sacrifice anything to see his friend's essence retained. It's a powerful story of friendship. Also, some of Shatner's patented overacting is hilarious here. There's a particular scene where he calls the Klingon vessel. He's faced with his back to the camera, and then he turns quickly into the shot, almost as if he wasn't expecting the hail. It's such a classic sci-fi move, and it cracked me right up. I also love the roguish nature of our crew as they disobey orders to boldly go once again, and the entire sequence of them hijacking the ship is fantastic fun, really, really enjoyable. Christopher Lloyd also does a pretty great job here too. He's a solid villain, ruthless and maniacal. I have to say, as much as I like the Klingons as our allies in the later shows, they do make wonderful antagonists, there's no doubt about it. What I will say is I'm not too keen on the return of Kirk's son in this one, however. Granted, of course it adds some consequences, but even at this point I haven't really felt much of a connection to him as a character, and so it lacks an emotional punch. So overall, a decent entry, one that I know a lot of people like, but just not really quite for me. Up next, and wow, we have something unique, singular, and a film that feels beyond my comprehension. We have Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. Have you ever wanted to take drugs, but didn't want the risk? Then I can't recommend this film enough. I think this is the most insane film that I've ever seen. Every idea is beyond the realms of reason. I think Harvey Bennett and Leonard Nimoy must have had an absolutely wild first half of the 80s that somehow resulted in this film being written and then, incredibly, the film being made. How can I describe the indescribable? How can I articulate the depths of this madness? There is a scene in the film that I watched just a little while ago where a mental patient is standing as if at the bottom of a deep well, surrounded by other mental patients, and at that moment she suddenly comes to the realisation that she's not crazy anymore. Well, I felt like watching this film made me realise how sane I was, purely because of the incomparable insanity of the film. An ancient probe of incredible power sent by an unknown alien race to speak to whales on planet Earth. For some reason only a whale could fathom. When it doesn't get a reply, it's like, well, this place clearly needs to be destroyed. So, quick as a flash, our crew of the Enterprise works out exactly what is going on. And they're like, well, I guess we better travel back in time to pick up one of these specific whales. Oh, did I not mention that? Whales still exist, but just not humpback whales, which for another incomprehensible reason are the only ones capable of chatting to this probe. What a movie. I enjoyed every crazy second of this fever dream. Absolutely and undeniably a highly recommended watch. And a double dumbass on everyone who watches it and doesn't love it. Next, and we have Star Trek V, The Final Frontier. Now, for a long time, I've remembered vividly a scene where there's a cliff and where Spock seems to come out of nowhere floating in the air. And as I've been going through the films, I've been wondering when that scene would crop up. It's something that I must have seen as a kid on TV, and it's just stuck with me ever since. I was thrilled when I saw that this is the film that I must have caught a snippet of. However, sadly, that wonderfully over-the-top and cheesy scene is where the good feelings more or less ended. I just didn't really enjoy this one at all. I thought the main bad guy was just absolutely awful. In so much as some films feel like they are made before their time, this really felt like it was made after its time. It felt like a relic, and I'm saying that with full knowledge that it was made in the 80s. So much is contrived and unearned here. The story goes along simply because it has to, and clunkily at that. Nothing feels natural, and so much is unexplained. I mean, how is Spock controlling people or getting them on his side so easily? How on earth did he manage to take over the Enterprise? That entire sequence made no sense to me. It simply happened because it had to, so that they could go on this journey. The reveal that it's Spock's brother has no impact and seems to make no difference, and they barely touch on Spock's rejection of logic. It's just honestly a mess from start to finish, and by far the weakest entry. And even though I haven't seen it for a while, either Insurrection or Nemesis, dare I say this is much, much worse than either of those. And it's one that I don't think I'm likely to revisit. Though one final positive to take away from the film was the wonderful line, "What does God need with a spaceship?" which I absolutely loved. So at least two good things to come out of this absolute heap of a film. And last but not least, we have Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. I'm glad to say that this one was significantly better than The Final Frontier, but unfortunately still for me very average. I'm honestly not even sure why they were continuing to make them at this point. Christopher Plummer feels like he could have been a great villain, but he's not really built up in any way and given so little to do. His entire character seems to exist only to quote Shakespeare endlessly, and sadly, not even in the original Klingon. I was also confused as to whether Michael Dorn was playing Worf or not in his cameo. One thing that I did like was Sulu having a more realistic progression here, as he's shown to be the captain of the Excelsior. Though I wonder whether he's separate because he wanted to have little to do with William Shatner at this point. I'm not sure. Either way, it feels good to have him solidly in command of a starship. I mean, Chekhov was a first officer, Spock a captain, Uhura said she was teaching classes at the academy, so what are they all doing in their old roles aboard the Enterprise? It just didn't make much sense, and yes, I know that point is a bit pedantic, as of course we all just want to see them in their old places, but it's just pushing the limits of believability at this point. This one does have a good core to the story, the idea of overcoming prejudice. However, it felt at once overdone and somehow at the same time underexplored. I also quite liked the idea of conspiracy, and I thought that was done fairly well here with a decent twist. I'd say overall, this one was uneven. Let's take the scene where Spock attempts to get information from Valeris's mind, which is almost torturous and disturbing, overly so for Star Trek, and then compare it to the Klingon prison section, which was pretty much completely comedic. Tonally, it just felt uneven. But coming off the back of The Final Frontier, just so much more enjoyable that I had actually a fairly decent time with it. And there we go, my thoughts on Star Trek 1 to 6. Just a final comment more on the series of films taken as a whole. I think one of the things that I found most disappointing was just the way that it feels like a vehicle for Nimoy and Shatner. While DeForest Kelley as Bones is truly fantastic and hilarious throughout all 6 of these, particularly Uhura, Sulu and Chekhov are given just so little to do, and it's gutting to see. They feel almost like extras, especially considering these are films with much longer runtime than any of the episodes. There's just so much more space for their characters to grow and evolve and showcase themselves, and the fact that it doesn't really happen over the course of 6 films was a bit of a downer, Sulu's command accepted of course. Even in the Voyage Home, where they are for the first time given a bit more to do, it's still so little considering they are central characters. And finally, to end on a high, I just wanted to comment quickly on how incredible all the posters are for these films. My goodness, the artwork is simply stunning for each one, and it's something that you just don't really see anymore. We get so many generic and frankly boring posters these days, but all 6 films here get some stunning work, and they beautifully capture something of the essence of Star Trek and the wonder of science fiction in each of them, I think. Well, what a journey it was watching these, with some wonderful highs and some shockingly low lows. I was not expecting such a wild variance in quality, I have to say, but it was great fun making my way through them. Let me know what your thoughts are on these. Do you agree with me? Disagree? I love talking about Star Trek, so if you'd like to, let's continue the discussion in the comments. Thank you so much for watching and for listening, and I'll see you next time.